Welcome to 10%. I'm your host, David Perry. You know, there is no greater teaching tool for history than the arts, and no greater repository of the arts, certainly in California, than San Francisco's Museum of Performance and Design. Tonight, we speak with Bill Eddelman. Welcome.
Right. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here.
Thank you. Now, you have been with the museum since before it was really a museum. Tell
Well,
those who don't know the history of
well, I've been connected
museum.
with it for now about 15 years as a board member, and at that time it was the San Francisco Performing Arts Library and Museum.
I remember when I first came to San Francisco in
Yes.
'87, that's what it was called, and I used to go over and just marvel at
Yes.
the collections you have.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think what's really incredible at this point, David, is the fact that we are celebrating our 65th year. Russell Hartley started the collection 65 years ago, and now we have a collection of over 3.5 million items.
Wow.
Very, very important. It's one of the major collections outside of New York City.
Now, besides being a board member, you yourself are a theater person. You
Yes.
taught theater at Stanford, and you have literally been around the world on an aisle seat, correct?
Well, I guess so. In many, I've seen a lot of productions.
Yeah.
Somebody said, "How do you meditate?" I said, "Through many bad theater productions." But I've been involved, of course, in theater and the arts since I started teaching at Stanford in 1970. I did my graduate degrees at Stanford, both master's and PhD. Applied for a Fulbright scholarship. I applied to Italy and was sent to Venice,
Must have
where I
been
lived
rough.
for a year.
Yeah, rough.
It's very rough, yes. But I get no sympathy at all.
Yeah.
So, yes, I taught 35 years at Stanford, both, of course, at the home campus, and then I taught 4 times at the Stanford Berlin Center, where I did classes in the 20s.
Now, I remember when I moved to San Francisco, PALM, as we called it, the Performing Arts Library and Museum, was already well known. And I remember a few years ago when they changed the name and expanded the mission. Why was that? And a lot of people, I think, still wonder, well, you know, what happened to PALM? They don't associate
that
the
was
two.
it, and a lot of people still refer to it as PALM, but what we found is we did some focus groups at the time. And of course, we have a very strong library and collection as the foundation. But we found that more people would be interested in coming, first of all, to a museum rather than a library. You think of the San Francisco Public Library, you think of the Bancroft, but all of the others are museums, and that has a broader, more general appeal, and that had to do with the shifting really around.
Right. And has that name changed proved to be popular?
I think so. I think the real problem too is that, you know, we all need to do more outreach in many ways and so forth. You know, it has to do budgetary considerations and how you make yourself well known. I think we're one of the better hidden secrets in San Francisco.
Although right there in the middle of town, between the Opera House and in front of San Francisco City Hall.
And with all of these collections dealing now with over 160 years of the performing arts in San Francisco, starting from the days of the gold rush.
Well, you know, that brings me to my next question. The history of San Francisco, of course, started long before European powers got here. It started with Native Americans.
Yes.
But the history that is reflected in the collection of the Museum of Performance and Design starts in 1849. What are some of your earliest artifacts?
Well, I think some of the really interesting artifacts have to do primarily with, like, for example, Chinese opera. We have one of the major Chinese opera collections in the entire United States because they came very early in the 1850s. We have some elements dealing with some of the tent shows, and of course, San Francisco just exploded, you might say, theatrically. So we have these photo archives of some of the great stars of the early 1850s and the 1860s.
Yeah, and why is it? I mean, you think about it, San Francisco was a city just built, you know, from nowhere.
It's almost instantaneous.
And instantaneous, you had the really great theater performers and musicians from Europe and the East Coast coming. What was it about San Francisco?
It was sort of like one of the great boom towns at that particular period. The gold was there, the money was there, and people poured into San Francisco from all over the world. So you suddenly had this mix of fortune seekers, people who were very intelligent, people who were very cultured, and whether you were a miner or whether you were somebody coming from maybe, let's say, the East Coast, you wanted the culture. And so looking at theater and looking at opera and so forth, it was almost ready-made. So San Francisco became a city almost overnight.
Right, so the arts and
Just
the history of San Francisco.
They came right along.
I always think of that wonderful anecdote that Armistead Maupin used in Tales of the City that supposedly Oscar Wilde said, whenever someone disappears, they're seen to be turned up in San Francisco. It must be a charming place.
Of course, absolutely. And there are a lot of other comments that could follow through that are that positive. But it really was, it's amazing when you consider it. We have playbills that go back into like the 1860s and that. And so it's a very, very interesting mix.
Now, you know, my first job in San Francisco was right next door at San Francisco Opera, and I remember then learning that San Francisco Opera was only the most recent opera company in San Francisco. There were several.
Many
I mean,
before.
the night of the great earthquake in 1906, the great Enrico Caruso was performing here, but there were other opera and theater companies.
Yes, there were many.
When was the boom time for theater and opera in San Francisco?
Well, the thing about it is it was sort of building even up to 1900, but I mean, you can think at least by the 1880s and the 1890s, it was extremely active. There were many, many companies. It was incredible to find a city that size that was doing that much at that particular time. And of course, we have pictures of Caruso. We have a large picture in our main gallery of him. And of course, after the night of the earthquake, he left San Francisco and was never going to return again. But it just happened. It's a very unique city, and it's a very unique experience to be a part of, you know, these incredible archives that start at around 1850.
So now, how did your museum manage to keep all of this? I mean, a lot disappeared in the flames and the cracks in the earth in 1906.
It's very interesting, and I come back to the fact of our 65th anniversary. It was started by Russell Hartley, who was both a dancer and a designer. He designed the costumes for the very first Nutcracker in the United States for San Francisco Ballet. He had, of course, no money. I mean, you know, generally artists don't. He started just collecting on his own. I think nowadays we probably use the term, almost like dumpster diving. But he, through various sales, through whatever was going on, he started to put the collection together. And of course, because of his dance career, we have a very strong dance section to the museum. But one man started it. That was it. And so over the years, he added to it and added to it and added to it. And then, of course, we've had wonderful gifts from many, many people over the following decades.
So give us an overview. What are some of the rarest items that you have?
Well, for example, we have some costumes from the Ballet Russe, from Le Coq d'Or, and a couple of other Ballet Russe productions. We have a wonderful Ballet Russe section, incredible programs in that, programs in depth. And as I was mentioning earlier, the Chinese opera, I think we have almost 400 images of the Chinese opera. And in fact, people have come out from New York in order to do research there. So those are two really interesting areas, dealing with theater personalities, theater buildings. We have a whole section called plays on file and so forth, and I don't know, there are several thousand in that. So you can go to one box and there's everything that you might want to know, let's say about maybe hair or whatever. So it's just incredible of all those pieces brought together, and of course all the programs, all the pictures and items and so forth.
Now the name of the museum is now the Museum of Performance and Design. So what is the design aspect and how does that
I'll explain partly how that happened, because I have been involved in both theatrical set and costume design at Stanford. That's always been a part of my career. And several years ago, I encouraged the board to adopt a kind of design section to the library. I mean, design is integral to all the performing arts. You might even say maybe even the symphony if you want to critique the soprano's dress. But the point about it is simply there, and we need to build on that. So books have come into the library focusing just on design, and these books now are international in scope. They deal with Europe, they deal with Asia, they deal with other parts of the world. And maybe in the future we can be thought of as almost like one-stop shopping. So the design element has become very important.
So how important is the museum to serious scholars? I mean, do people come from other parts of the country, even internationally, to say, you know, I want to learn about the Chinese opera, or I want to learn about, you know, I'm doing a film on San Francisco pre-earthquake. What was it like? Do they come to you?
Yes, absolutely, because we would have the files, very definitely. And we're getting comments all the time, whether it's through emails or visitors or telephone calls or something along those lines, because of what we have. It's used in all different kinds of productions. I mean, for example, the recent Tales of the City musical at ACT, they were doing research with us. You know, we're that all-encompassing. In fact, Kirsten Tanaka, who's the wonderful librarian at the museum, refers to us, as I mentioned, as to one-stop shopping in the future. And yes, we get calls from people in Europe. The Anna Halpern collection, sections of that have been sent over to France. So yes, it has a local focus, but developing some international reach.
Now, in the next few months, you're going to be going on hiatus, correct?
Well, what will happen is this. We will be there until the end of December.
Of this year, 2012.
Of this year, 2012. And then the building will begin to close down, because in the first part of May in 2013, everything will be closed down. Everybody will leave the building, and it'll probably be 3 years of retrofitting.
And this is a direct reaction to the 1989 earthquake.
Absolutely, absolutely. Since they've done City Hall and they've done the Opera House, this is now the time, particularly with Herbst there. They really need to make certain the building is very safe. And years ago, a bond issue didn't pass. Now they're at a point where this will happen. And the 4th floor where we are now, I understand, will all be taken over by the opera. They're going to bring together a group of disparate sections of their activities and put them under one floor.
In our last few moments, tell me, what is your personal favorite item in the collection?
It's hard. Oh, I'll tell you probably, whether it's an item, I think there are certain very unusual books in that we have collected over the years, dealing with international design. Some of them dealing with Chinese opera. Some of them dealing, for example, with the incredible European experimental designers, Russia, Poland, and Germany, France, and Italy.
Right. Now, if someone wants to donate to the museum, if they have something and they say, you know, Bill, I've got something that's historic, who do they call? Do they call you? Do they call?
Well, they could contact Kirsten Tanaka at the library, and then we have a collections committee that evaluates this to see if it works for us. Does it work? Doesn't it work? Do we have it? Or whatever. So there are a lot of possibilities, and of course we've existed in terms of really wonderful donations, and we're very happy to receive those that further our mission and strengthen our collections.
Right, and if someone wants to learn more about the work of the almost called it the wrong thing, called it POM,
no, I know.
Museum of Performance and Design.
What they can do is they can go to mpdsf.org.
Great.
In San Francisco.
Thanks so much. We've been speaking with Bill Eddelman from San Francisco's Museum of Performance and Design. Next up, we meet filmmaker H.P. Mendoza and learn about the ongoing work of the Asian American Film Festival. We'll be right back.